Dr. Rasnick of the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology at the University of California, Berkeley, has studied AIDS for 20 years.
Whenever I talk about AIDS, invariably, at some point, a question interrupts what I'm saying, and usually that question is, but what about Africa? So I've decided to make that the title of my talk today. I was in South Africa May and July of 2000. I was there as a member of President Thabo Mbeki's AIDS advisory panel. And one of the very first things we did, many of us on the panel, well, at least several of us, the so-called dissidents, was to ask a very simple question. How many AIDS cases and AIDS deaths were there in South Africa? Well, virtually every one of the panel members were shocked by the answer that was given. We don't know. We don't keep those statistics, we were told. And as we have this, this nice gathering here today, we still don't have those statistics. And so you may wonder where all this hubbub is coming from, the 30 to 40 million AIDS cases. They call them HIV/AIDS cases. They run together, the two things, HIV and AIDS, which is a very effective ploy if you want to obscure what's really going on. For example, the WHO has recorded just a little over 2 million AIDS cases cumulatively in the past 2 decades of AIDS. And yet, we hear these stories about 30 million, 40 million AIDS cases, and about a third of them have died. So what's going on? Well, in the United States, AIDS has virtually disappeared. There are so few new AIDS cases in San Francisco, for example, that you could know them all by name. You don't hear too many stories about AIDS in the United States because there's not very much, so we have to move to Africa and India and China. I had a lot of data to show you. That's why I wanted to use this presentation, because I don't like to just talk about these things and criticize the contagious HIV hypothesis without giving evidence so that people can judge for themselves where the truth lies. The contagious HIV hypothesis is the biggest scientific medical blunder of all time. One reason why I continue to give talks all over the world, rarely in the United States, I should say. This is one of the very first meetings where I've talked about AIDS in the United States, where I was in a room full of kindred spirits, people who are willing to question authority, to check the data, and don't just swallow things. I give talks all over Europe to groups very similar to this in many ways, and I was surprised. I just about gave up on the United States until I was invited. Actually, Peter Duisberg was invited to give the talk here, and he's in Germany, so he sent the B team, and that's me. And the B team's not doing a very good job. I have no idea what's going on here. I'll reboot it one more time, and if that doesn't do it, I think the thing to do is just ad lib, and then we'll have a dialogue.
We're seeing the screen, but that's the whole thing.
Yeah. So let me just get right into what I know about AIDS and then about Africa. I started studying AIDS in 1980 when I moved to California to start a little biotech company. And at that time, AIDS was a brand new thing. I'm a chemist by training, and I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for many years on cancer, arthritis, emphysema, and parasites. And AIDS was this very strange thing in the early 1980s that was happening curiously only to gay men. And there were diseases, Kaposi sarcoma, cryptosporidium, pneumocystis carinii, pneumonia, cytomegalovirus, this whole list of bizarre diseases that I as a chemist had never heard of before. And they were only happening in gay men. So that made me very interested as a scientist, because there was a book written in the 1970s, I believe it was, called The Andromeda Strain, and they made a movie out of it, and about this really bizarre thing from outer space. Well, I thought AIDS was my Andromeda strain. And I was a young scientist in my 30s, eager as all the scientists that I had met in California to begin working on AIDS because it was the most exciting thing. It was so bizarre. So for 4 years, I was going to conferences and collaborating with my friends in San Francisco and around the world, but none of us knew how to work on AIDS because we didn't know what it was. And then in April 23rd, 1984, clarity presented itself. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, held a press conference where she divulged to the world that an employee of the National Institutes of Health, Robert Gallo, had discovered the probable cause of AIDS. It was one of his retroviruses that we call HIV now. They dropped the word probable the very next day. And ever since that time, we have the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and virtually every other health organization around the world has clicked its heels, saluted, and marched off to war against HIV, even though there was no evidence that AIDS, first of all, was contagious, sexually transmitted, or caused by any infectious pathogen. In fact, prior to April 23rd, 1984, the Centers for Disease Control and most, if not all, of the current crop of mainstream AIDS scientists had actually figured out what AIDS was in the United States. It was a lifestyle phenomenon, and they knew what it was due to. It was due to the chronic use of recreational drugs, heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, nitrites, that sort of thing. And I don't mean just minor uses of this, I mean chronic uses, like for 5 to 10 years. Think of it like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day for a couple of decades. A person should not be surprised if they have upper respiratory problems or if they get cancer or emphysema. The same thing as if a person drinks a fifth of scotch a day. You know, no surprise that you're going to have some problems down the road. Well, when you inhale 15 milliliters of amyl or butyl nitrite, one of the most chemically reactive, toxic mutagens and carcinogens known, you shouldn't be surprised after doing that for, let's say, 5 or 10 years, that you don't come down with serious problems. For example, Kaposi sarcoma, these purplish lesions on the face. Or you have immune deficiency problems. Or who knows what's going to happen. You take that on top of cocaine and heroin, you're going to have serious problems. Well, in 1984, I didn't know all of this. I assumed these people had gotten it right, that they knew what they were doing, and I, as a chemist who specialized in making protease inhibitors, would just do my little part. So I asked my virology friends, what kind of protease would a retrovirus have, knowing that most viruses have at least one protease. It's an enzyme necessary for its replication. They told me an aspartyl protease. So I immediately started making protease inhibitors within a few weeks after April 23rd, 1984. I stopped that for commercial reasons, purely commercial reasons a few months later, because my little biotech company was too small to compete with Abbott Laboratories, who had 20 chemists over several years that were making similar inhibitors for human aspartyl proteases. But I still assumed that Robert Gallo and Luc Montagnier and the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control had gotten it right about AIDS, it being contagious, sexually transmitted, and caused by their retrovirus. In 1985, I happened to overhear in San Francisco a couple of my virology colleagues talking to each other, people I'd known for a long time. I'm not a virologist, but I was privy to their conversation many times. And I heard one virologist who was talking to the other one. The first virologist had not worked with HIV. And the other virologist was working with HIV. So the first one asked him, what is the titer of HIV in AIDS patients? That's the technical word for how much is there. And the second virologist, the one working on HIV, said undetectable. Now I was still thinking in my Andromeda mode. I was, at first even more astounded by this and wanted to work on it even more. Here you have something that was undetectable, yet was causing all of this devastation in the gay community. I thought, wow, that has to be the most toxic substance known to humans. I've actually worked with botulism toxin in the past, which is the most toxic substance on the planet, other than radiation. And it turned out that the calculation showed, like plutonium, for example, if you inhale it, it turned out that the level of HIV would be something like 1 billion to 1 trillion-fold more toxic than botulism toxin, based on the data at hand. So then at that point, I realized there must be something wrong. They probably got the wrong virus. That's where I made my little step at a time. I didn't immediately throw away the contagious HIV hypothesis. I just, not all of it, I just threw away the HIV part. For example, with polio, doctors and scientists threw away about 100 viruses before they settled on the one that they said caused polio. So I thought they would probably find the real culprit at some point at another time. But in 1987, now we have 7 years into AIDS, 1987, nothing else happened. We were still on this juggernaut on HIV, contagious, sexually transmitted plague, devastating gay men in the United States, basically IV drug users, and then moving on into Africa and other places. But at that time, it was very clear after 7 years, I was slow to learn, but I finally figured it out, that the whole thing was completely wrong. AIDS did not behave anything like a contagious disease. For example, the diseases, there's 26 different ones now that have nothing to do with each other, from diarrhea to dementia to Kaposi sarcoma to various pneumonias to cervical cancer. What do they have to do with each other? Absolutely nothing, unless you have antibodies to HIV. Then they're all called AIDS. And instead of treating your pneumonia or your cervical cancer or these other things, you're given toxic drugs, the anti-HIV drugs, which make sure eventually that you do come down with AIDS and die. So, and other arguments against the contagious HIV hypothesis. To this day, 8 out of 9 AIDS cases in the United States are men. 2/3 are gay men. Back in the 80s, it was virtually exclusively more than 9 out of 10 AIDS cases were men, and most of them were gay men or IV drug users. People hear about pediatric AIDS cases and hemophiliacs. They've always represented about 1% of the total AIDS cases in the USA. And the pediatric AIDS cases, 85% of them, their mothers admitted using recreational drugs during pregnancy. And then there's the others due to malnutrition. So AIDS is a very strange infectious disease. Instead of behaving like all other infectious diseases that rise, peak, and decline over a period of weeks to a period of months after people develop, either they die off or they develop immunity to the infectious disease. Think of a seasonal flu. Think of the measles, the mumps, the chickenpox, anything. Even the plague that decimated London in 1665 spanned over just several weeks, a few weeks before it came and disappeared. On the other hand, you have lifestyle diseases, for example, like lung cancer due to cigarette smoking and whatever other causes, which does span decades. It's not peaked yet in the United States. Well, AIDS is very much like a lifestyle disease. It shows a non-random distribution of these various AIDS-defining diseases. Kaposi sarcoma, for example, is exclusively seen in gay men. 98% of AIDS Kaposi sarcoma is in gay men. You don't see it in IV drug users. You don't see it in hemophiliacs. You don't see it in pediatric AIDS cases. You rarely see it in so-called African AIDS cases. And then in the children, you get bacterial pneumonia and not pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. That's again in the gay men. In the gay men, you don't see tuberculosis, but you see that in children, in hemophiliacs, and in Africans. So, and then hemophiliacs get almost none of the AIDS-defining diseases, except a little bit of a little bit of thrush, a yeast infection, and one other thing which I forget. But nothing else. Dementia, they don't get dementia. That's basically the gay men and IV drug users or people on the anti-HIV drugs. And the time course, as I'd mentioned before, we have AIDS rising from small numbers around 1980, 81, when it was first reported formally in 81, to a peak in 1992 to 93. And it's been going down steadily ever since. So we're spanning now 20 years, we're starting our 3rd decade of AIDS. Again, remember, a flu or some real honest-to-God infectious diseases rises, peaks, and declines over a period of weeks to months. AIDS is also very bizarre in that, just to sum up, in that it knows whether you're male or female, gay or straight, white or black, rich or poor. It even knows what zip code you live in. For example, in San Francisco, as of November 2000, 99% of all AIDS cases cumulatively still in San Francisco were men. 99%. It's basically the gay community thing. And by the way, I want to intervene really quick here and clear up a thing. Sex has absolutely nothing to do with AIDS. It's only those gay men that were using these astronomical levels of recreational drugs that were the ones that came down with AIDS. Peter Duesberg and I have been looking for decades now for examples of drug-free AIDS cases. There's none reported in the literature. There's no study that shows HIV-positive people who do not have other things associated with them, like recreational drug use, for example, or hemophilia, where they're already sick, that get AIDS just because they're infected with HIV. Now, AIDS, as I said, has peaked in the United States, and one reason why you don't hear too much of it is because of that fact in the United States. So this AIDS juggernaut, every one of us in this room, all American citizens, I bet you cannot guess, even come close to estimating how much American taxpayers have spent cumulatively on AIDS in the past 20 years. There may be some people in here, maybe the journalists, that might know. Well, I do know. You can go to the executive branch of the government, their website, and get the numbers. As of this year, we will have spent $118 billion on AIDS. We spent $22 billion to put 12 men on the moon. We got our money's worth. But that $118 billion has not saved one AIDS case. In fact, AMFAR, the world's largest AIDS organization, uses the complete failure to cure anybody or to really treat anybody effectively with AIDS to raise more money. We see it on the sides of the buses in San Francisco. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 saved. They use that abject failure of the contagious HIV paradigm to actually ask you for more billions of dollars. And it goes up. This year we're spending $12 billion on AIDS. Next year will even be more. The funding for AIDS has never gone down. And President Bush has recently signed into law $15 billion AIDS allocation money over the next 5 years for mostly Africa. I think most of the money goes there in the Caribbean. Now, what we have bought with this $118 billion is a huge mega industry. I call it AIDS Incorporated. We have 100,000 scientists and physicians who've built their careers and staked their reputations on the contagious HIV hypothesis. And they've gotten it completely wrong. At this late date, it would take superhuman courage and integrity for these people to even allow a bit of a discussion about, well, maybe they don't quite have it right. Maybe AIDS is not sexually transmitted. Maybe it's not HIV, or even entertain that there's other things involved. It's just gone too far for that. And we're seeing it in Africa right now. Get to the African stuff. President Thabo Mbeki is the only head of state who is questioning the contagious HIV hypothesis of AIDS. You'll read in the New York Times that he has said that he doesn't accept that hypothesis. He has never said it. He just says that there's lots of problems with it, and he invited the world's leading AIDS experts to his country to help advise him and his ministers as to what to do with what they were told was going to devastate their country. He was told that 25% of his population, of his people, citizens, were infected with HIV. And of course, the current dogma is that in 8 to 10 years, 50% of these people will come down with AIDS and die. That's a massive thing for any country to have to confront. So he would be derelict as a president if he didn't take it seriously and try to understand this. But when he invited these AIDS experts, 2/3 of which were the mainstream scientists from the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, the Medical Research Councils, 2 South Africa, and 1/3 were from around the world, dissidents such as myself. To South Africa, he was vilified and ridiculed and was attacked with all sorts of ad hominems. And to this day, that pressure is still going on. At the AIDS conference in May, when we all got there, and there was a certain hope that we would finally at least address in public some of these issues. Why AIDS doesn't behave like a contagious disease. The mainstream has accepted that it takes 1,000 sexual contacts with an HIV positive person before you can expect to get antibodies to HIV. And how can that sustain a sexually transmitted disease when, for example, gonorrhea or syphilis takes 2 to 3 sexual contacts? And the Africans are no more promiscuous than the people in the United States, probably even less so. So they're very resentful when Americans and Europeans come to Africa. Some of the most sexually promiscuous people on the planet are telling these Africans how to behave, and they're going to have to control their sexual behavior because that's what's leading to all of this devastation. Now let me go back. I'm just, as you can see, ad-libbing from my mind, but I think 20 years of studying this gives me lots of information that I could pass on to you. We have 5 different definitions of AIDS, all currently active right now. And you're always diagnosed according to the earliest one that you satisfy. Africa is so different, doesn't look anything like what's going on in the United States, that the WHO and the CDC met at a little town called Bangui in the Central African Republic in October of 1985 to come up with a definition of AIDS in Africa. It doesn't even require HIV in their definition. Here's all you need to have AIDS in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa: fever, diarrhea, weight loss, persistent cough, and as of the middle 1990s, tuberculosis. While I was in the Peace Corps in Papua New Guinea, I had all of those except TB. So while I was in the Peace Corps, I guess I was an AIDS case until I landed back in the United States, where we have a different definition of AIDS. Voila, I no longer have AIDS. Think about it. Diarrhea, persistent cough, weight loss, tuberculosis. These are endemic diseases in Africa and always have been. In the 1970s, we would see on television commercials for care packages, send the care package to Africa. We would see these little children with distended bellies, bloated bellies, they were suffering from malnutrition. Now we see the exact same children in Africa, but now they're AIDS cases. And instead of sending them useful things like drugs and useful medicine, we send them condoms, AZT, and preach safe sex. And it was these contradictions, these things about AIDS, how it is so different in the United States and Europe compared with Africa, that President Thabo Mbeki wanted to understand, wanted to straighten it out. It's like saying people in Africa, if they get measles, it's completely different from people in the United States or Germany or Italy or someplace. And of course, there's no example of that, really. And he asked us, the AIDS experts around the world, to help them sort it out in open forum. Well, unfortunately, the mainstream AIDS establishment, the CDC and the National Institutes of Health, were there in body at 2 meetings of the AIDS conference in May and July of 2000. But they were not there in spirit. They essentially boycotted the meeting. They did not participate. And between the May meeting and the July meeting, the government had set up a secure website for all of the participants to discuss the issues, come up whatever agreement they could on some topics, and then those areas that they couldn't agree on, come up with an agenda for the next meeting in July. Well, the mainstream completely boycotted that internet exchange. So they were actually, it was a stupid strategy, because we dissidents, we like to talk and we're not afraid of talking. So we had, for 2 months, we had the exclusive ear of the president of South Africa, his ministers, and the other people who were observing this thing. So we got to talk and everything, and the other side didn't take the opportunity. They claim they have overwhelming evidence that AIDS is contagious, sexually transmitted, caused by HIV. They have vilified us for being evil, wicked people, Holocaust deniers. They recently, people at Berkeley have called Duisberg and me, they've said that we have African blood dripping from our fingers. If we're such horrible people, they had a great opportunity to expose us there in public in South Africa. It was their duty, if they really had the truth, it was their duty and obligation to show the president of South Africa and his ministers that we were a bunch of charlatans and we would be exposed to all the world. Instead, they chose silence. And I can tell you as a scientist, silence is a tacit admission that the other side won. Because one of the things that we do, it's part of the job, since most of what we do is fail, we have to have fun while we're failing, is that we like to criticize our colleagues and point out the mistakes that they've made. It happens all the time. But when you can't do that, it's a clear indication that, boy, there's no holes that they can find. So this is one bit of evidence that I give people when I say that the other side, the mainstream, know they've got it wrong about the contagious HIV hypothesis of AIDS. They do not behave like people who are confident in their position. You know, they had everything on their side. Money, the numbers, and their view, the moral high ground, and they didn't take the opportunity to do anything about it. And because President Mbeki was investigating the truth, trying to find out, he did the right thing. He brought both sides. In fact, the mainstream outnumbered us 2-1. And they didn't participate, and at the second meeting in July, the government on 3 separate occasions really just vented their anger at the mainstream. For the government went to such great trouble and expense to have this exercise, and the mainstream would not participate. And what they did during this time, the government found out that during that 2-month interval, the internet debate or discussion that the mainstream did not participate in, they set up their own secure private website. I don't know if it was secure. And they instituted what was called the Durban Declaration, because there was going to be the Durban International AIDS Conference that July also in Durban, South Africa. And instead of presenting their arguments to Mbeki's AIDS panel and his ministers, they published the Durban Declaration in Nature magazine and just basically read the catechism of the mainstream AIDS dogma, and said that was it. Of course, that's really angered the government of South Africa. Now let me give you some information that I was going to show you the data with, which we're not able to do, about where these numbers come from. As I mentioned, one of the first things that we did in South Africa, that first meeting, was to try to get a handle on this thing called AIDS, this catastrophe that you read about in the New York Times. 15 or 25 million AIDS cases and all these people dying left and right. And we asked the people of South Africa how many AIDS cases did they have, how many AIDS deaths. And they don't keep those numbers, they don't know. And South Africa is the richest country in sub-Saharan Africa. So where do these numbers come from? The WHO has cataloged a grand total of just a little over 2 million AIDS cases cumulatively throughout the world. There's a little over 800,000 of those are in the United States. The rest are largely in Africa. A little over 1 million AIDS cases cumulatively as of 2001, the WHO tells us. So where does the 30 million and all that come from? Well, what happens is that since the definition of AIDS in Africa doesn't require testing for antibodies to HIV, HIV is not even part of it, but yet it's still part of the dogma, the contagious sexually transmitted AIDS, that and it's too expensive, by the way. It costs $55 roughly to do an HIV test, and most sub-Saharan African countries have, on average, around $5 total for the health care budget for every individual throughout their country. So it's prohibitively expensive to do the test. So they take blood, leftover discarded blood, from prenatal clinics, women who are pregnant, about to give birth, and they get the blood that's being discarded. And they do HIV antibody tests, measuring antibodies to HIV in this discarded blood. And they typically come up with numbers like 25% of them are HIV positive or 30%. It's been about 25% now over the past 5 years, very stable, of these pregnant women. They never take note of whether they're healthy or sick or what they're sick with. They never take note or into consideration the fact that the instructions that come with the antibody test tell you that pregnancy is one of the leading causes of false positive antibodies to HIV. They never take into consideration that malaria, hepatitis infection, the flu vaccination, so over 60 other known, documented in the mainstream AIDS literature, ways of producing false positive antibodies to HIV. So, and by the way, something like 95% of sub-Saharan Africans are antibody positive for hepatitis B, and yet they don't have hepatitis. That's another story. So then they take this 25% of pregnant women that have antibodies to HIV in a few clinics in Uganda and Kenya and South Africa, and they just pluck a number out of the air that roughly 1.1 men must be HIV positive for every pregnant woman. And then they extrapolate this number across the continent to 650 million Africans. And that's where they come up with the 30 million AIDS cases. Now let me tell you what has happened during the first 2 decades of AIDS. Remember, AIDS, we're told, started in Africa. Robert Gallo told us this in 1984, that AIDS started in Africa. Americans never have their own disease. You know, we have the swine flu, the Asian flu, we have AIDS out of Africa. We never have a red, white, and blue epidemic. So that means that we've had at least 2 decades of AIDS in Africa. And they're telling us we got all these millions. Well, you can go to the CIA's website if you want and get their statistics on the population of the world. You can go to the United States Census Bureau, which keeps the data for all the countries in the world, which we've done. And we've looked at on an annual basis, at least as much as you can get on an annual basis. Certainly in the industrialized world, you get it and they extrapolate and then they have a census like every 10 years or whatever. And Africa gained 274 million people during the first 2 decades of AIDS, from 1980 to 2000. That's equivalent to the population of the United States. It took us several centuries to get that number. It took Africa 20 years to generate that population. And remember, the WHO has told us as of 2001 that the cumulative total of AIDS cases that they've documented in Africa is 1 million, 1.09 million AIDS cases. At the same time that they gained 274 million people. You couldn't even distinguish a number, that's the number in the background. If all of those 1 million people died from AIDS over the 20 years, you couldn't even detect it with the methods in Africa, certainly, that to even get a handle that there's something going on. So just the total population growth in Africa argues against AIDS has been equated with the Black Death and the plague of the Middle Ages. Well, the plague of the Middle Ages, people tend to agree it must have killed maybe 1/3 of the Europeans. But here we're having 250 million gain in people in South Africa during this time. I mean, in all of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa is the richest country. It has the best statistics. Since 1996 through 2001, the latest data, I had a really recent data point, it just came out last week from the census. They took a census. They gained from a little under 40 million people to about 46 million people from 1996. A slow growth of about 2% a year. Typically in sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 3.5, 3.6 growth rate annually. South Africa was about 2%. And it's a steady increase. And then they also give you the mortality data from that time. It's a lower slope, and it also goes up, but the slope is constant. There is no increase in the rate of mortality, only an increase in the number of people every year that die, but it's completely explained by the increase in the population of the country. There is no evidence at all that anything unusual is going on in South Africa, where they have the best statistics. Other evidence that has been very provocative, and President Mbeki would like to have answers to, how is it that there is no correlation between HIV, AIDS, or HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea and chlamydia? There's no correlation in place, there's no correlation in time. They have a number of provinces in South Africa, and you have, for example, the Western Cape has the highest level of syphilis and the lowest level of antibodies to HIV. Then you have KwaZulu-Natal, it has it just the other way around. The highest level of antibodies to HIV and the lowest level of syphilis. In fact, if you plot, which I had, can't show you, a graph of that, you would see an X-plot. One would be, let's say, HIV, one would be syphilis. There's no correlation, and yet they're said to be transmitted similarly. And the same is true with gonorrhea. Gonorrhea and syphilis and chlamydia all go together. HIV is the only one that goes opposite. That's in place. The same is true in Uganda and in Thailand. In Uganda and South Africa, they've been having, over the past 5 years or so, efforts to reduce sexually transmitted diseases, all sexually transmitted diseases, by using condoms, by treating infections, by education. And they've had actually a very profound effect on syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. They've been able to reduce them about half in some of the really high regions in Uganda and South Africa and also in Thailand. Unfortunately, they've had absolutely no effect on the level of antibodies to HIV. In South Africa, for example, as syphilis is going down over the past 5 years, HIV has been going up in the same population that come to these sexually transmitted disease clinics. So there's no correlation between the level of antibodies to HIV and AIDS. There's no correlation between sexually transmitted diseases and AIDS. And Mbeki he's justified in wanting to know how this can be. And yet the mainstream AIDS establishment refuses to explain it to him. We ask the questions, and Mbeki asks the questions, and the mainstream AIDS establishment is completely mute on this subject. Then I'm going to skip a little bit here because I think the best way to do this is with a dialogue question and answer, since I can't do my dog and pony show. Now when I go through the, what about Africa, and I talk about Africa, then there's the next question that I get, well, aren't the protease inhibitor cocktails the so-called HAART, highly active antiretroviral therapy? That's got to be, it's saving all these lives, and that means you can't be right. HIV must be right. So that's the next thing. You attack all the arguments, and then they say, oh, what about Africa? Then you show what's going on in Africa, and they say, oh, well, what about the drugs? It's got to be working. Well, are they really? The Centers for Disease Control, their own data, their HIV/AIDS surveillance reports, show us that AIDS peaked in the United States in 1992 to 1993, years before the introduction or the approval by the FDA of the cocktails, the highly active antiretroviral therapy, which was sometime in 1996. So you have what these drugs have done in this case is that when you have the natural decline of AIDS, and then you have some intervention that comes in after the natural decline, you can take credit for it. That's one thing they've done. They've taken credit for the fact that they're now introducing new therapies at a time when AIDS was naturally in decline. That's one part of the story. Another part of the story, remember I told you there are 5 definitions of AIDS that are currently active. In 1993 was the last major definition change, where for the first time the CDC added non-diseases to the roles of full-blown AIDS. That was 1993. All you had to do was have 2 laboratory tests, be antibody positive to HIV, and have fewer than 200 CD4 cells, certain type of white blood cells, per microliter of blood. And then you're a full-blown AIDS case statistic. In 1997, that was the last year that the CDC actually reported by a breakdown all of the AIDS cases according to their AIDS-indicating diseases, whether it was pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, cryptosporidium, cervical cancer, whatever. That was the last year they did that breakdown. And that year, 61% of all new AIDS cases came under that one provision of the 93 definition. They had no symptoms of disease. They just had 2 laboratory tests. And now over 75% of all new AIDS cases in the United States come under that. They have no diseases. When you start adding large numbers of healthy people to the roles of a supposedly 100% lethal disease, that automatically reduces the mortality rate. We presented this at the AIDS conference down it was Pretoria and also Johannesburg, the two different sites in South Africa in 2001. The mainstream didn't refute any of it. In fact, they remained silent. And the last thing before I open it up to questions is about the therapies. There's no study, no clinical trial anywhere in the scientific medical literature that shows that HIV positive people or people with AIDS, those are two different groups, they can't overlap, live longer or at least better lives than a similar group of people who do not take those drugs. Conversely, there's many studies that show that the opposite is true. In fact, the early studies with AZT were the only ones that ever had placebo controls. We're actually looking at if a drug makes a difference to AIDS cases. The people on AZT in 3 different studies in the United States, in Europe, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe, showed that people on AZT had a 25% higher mortality rate than the other people who were not taking the drugs. In the United States, we have killed tens of thousands of Americans with AZT all by itself. These drugs were AZT, DDI, 3TC, were developed in the 1960s as chemotherapy for cancer. They're cytotoxic, they're designed to kill cells. Some of them, AZT for example, are still used to treat cancer. Now, this chemotherapy, it's cancer chemotherapy we're giving to HIV positive people and pregnant women, for example. You have on the side of a beer can, don't drink beer when you're pregnant, but it's okay to take AZT, chemotherapy. If you were an oncologist and you prescribed chemotherapy for the lifetime of a patient, you would certainly be called up on charges, probably malpractice, maybe even homicide, because you know you're going to kill the patient if you do that. That's why chemotherapy is given to cancer patients for weeks to months. Try to kill the cancer before you kill the patient. If you're HIV positive, you can get the exact same drugs for life. And these drugs are extremely toxic. They destroy the bone marrow. That's why you have to have blood transfusion. Your hair falls out. That's why you have diarrhea. It destroys the very fast replacement cells in the intestines. And these are AIDS-defining diseases, by the way. And if you start AZT, a group headed by Paluda in 1993 showed that you have a 50-50 chance of coming down with lymphoma 3 years later if you start AZT. Guess what lymphoma is? It's AIDS-defining. And virtually everybody in the United States who's HIV positive is taking these nucleoside analog drugs along with protease inhibitors, and they're getting AIDS-defining diseases. And when they die, they're saying it's AIDS-related instead of drug-related. So anyway, I guess I'll leave it there. I've talked a lot. I've just sort of rambled on because I had to completely shift my talk here because of technology. So why don't we have some questions if you want, and then see what we can do with that.
How do you answer the mainstream scientists that show that the retrovirus impairs T cell function in various ways?
Well, it's very simple. Excuse me. There's a number of ways to show that from the mainstream's own literature. For example, the HIV antibody test. Robert Gallo was the one who grew HIV in T cells, the very cells that they're supposed to kill. And they don't kill these cells. They have been replicating in vats at Abbott Laboratories since 1984 and haven't killed those T cells yet. And that's where we get the antigens, the viral proteins from, to do the HIV antibody test. So Abbott Laboratories is about almost a 20-year experiment showing that HIV doesn't kill those T cells in their vats. They're making about $1 billion a year on these non-kill CD4 T cells. Luc Montagnier and many others have published in the scientific literature. Luc Montagnier was the one who actually discovered HIV. That HIV does not kill cells. It does not kill T cells. There's numerous publications in the literature that HIV does not kill T cells. And there's no surprise there. People have studied retroviruses for almost 100 years. The fact that they don't kill the host cell is one of the reasons why they were hypothesized to be cancer-causing agents back during the war on cancer, Nixon's war on cancer back in the 70s. That's why they were studied so much, because they don't kill the cells that they infect. And in human beings, nobody has actually ever obtained viable free infectious HIV from a human being. Somebody has hepatitis, it's easy, you can get the titer. Remember in 1985, they had no detectable HIV in their AIDS cases. So I could go on and on and on, but we got a long line here.
I've got two unrelated questions. In his foreword to Peter Duesberg's book, Kerry Monis said that at that time that there was no primary source peer-reviewed reference for the proposition that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. Is that still true?
That's still true.
You cannot find it anywhere in literature that as a primary reference that says HIV is the cause of AIDS.
That's right. Not only that, we cannot find anybody who takes responsibility for that statement. That's what I ask journalists and other people. I say very simply, come up with a name or names of the person or persons who have shown, first of all, that AIDS is contagious, that AIDS is sexually transmitted, or that HIV causes AIDS. Just give us the name. Scientists, I've been told probably the only people that have a bigger ego than us are journalists, or TV anchormen. That's probably true. We love to take credit for what we do. We love to steal credit from other people. I hope I don't. But Robert Gallo stole HIV from Luc Montagnier. So I think it's very, very telling that you cannot find a name of anybody that you can pin on that this person is the one we should give the Nobel Prize for or whatever, that has proven or shown or even likely that HIV is the cause of AIDS. We don't have those names. Robert Gallo's never claimed it. Luc Montagnier has never claimed it. So who is it?
The news stories just in the recent months have said that Uganda has had an experience of reducing incidence of AIDS and HIV significantly by their so-called ABC program. How does this comport with the non-contagious theory of AIDS?
Well, I tell you, if you find it in the newspapers on television, you should be very skeptical of it. Sometimes they tell the truth, but they're so mixed in with things that aren't, and half-truths that we heard about yesterday. How do you know what's going on? I look at the scientific literature. That's what I look at, and I look at the experimental sections and the results sections to try to get this information. There has never been an AIDS epidemic, whatever, in Uganda to begin with. There was this level of about 30-35%, they claim, prevalence of HIV all the way back to 1984 in Uganda. It's about the same level today. And Uganda, just like all other African countries during the past 20 years, has increased its population. Uganda has about a 3.6% growth rate in population, much higher than even South Africa. So I don't know where they get that information from.
There was one number I think explained just about everything, and that was that $118 billion.
Right. You're right, it explains a lot.
No, that is probably 99.9% of the problem, because that can buy as much propaganda as you ever wanted in the whole world. As you may know, that the person that President Bush has appointed to this boondoggle of $15 billion is the former chairman of Eli Lilly.
Right.
That's what they're going to do, is to sell a bunch more pills to not do anything.
Right.
Now, my question is that about 10 years ago, I read this book, Why We Will Never Win the War on AIDS.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this book has a very curious history to it, because at the time I bought it, it was being shredded and banned and recalled by the publisher, I think it was H.R. Regnery,
right,
because there's so much money to be made in fooling people. Now, the question I'm coming up with, so I want to know a little more about what happened.
I can tell you that story.
Yeah, but what is the current best book or source of information that you guys are putting out now that we can all rely on?
Okay, well, actually, it's that book there, but it's now called Inventing the AIDS Virus. You see, one of the co-authors, Brian Ellison, went off on his own, and he broke the contractual relationship with one of the other publishers that first had it and sold it to Regnery. So Regnery, he wouldn't agree with Regnery or anything, so he went off on his own and published the book, and that's the one that you have in your hand. And the reason that they were trying to get rid of the book, Regnery published the same book, Inventing the AIDS Virus, minor editorial things, in 1996. And it was the fact that Brian Ellison went off on his own and published it at his own expense, you know, competing with the publisher. That's why the publisher was angry with it. Not because he didn't want the word out. He wanted to make money off of Duisberg's book and not off of this pirated version of it.
Okay, so let's do this stuff.
It's pretty much the same book.
There's room tonight for all of you to ask your questions if you're succinct.
I'll try to be fast.
I don't have any dispute with what you're saying, but sometimes I talk to like medical students who say, well, we have these microscopes now, we can see the AIDS virus going in and doing these things. What are they telling these students that they're making them think they're actually seeing this phenomenon occur?
Well, it's catechism, basically. How do you know what you're seeing is what it is? I'm an organic chemist, and I used to synthesize lots of molecules, inhibitors for enzymes. It'd be crystalline substance, pure, nothing else in there. We had to come in it from many different directions. Nuclear magnetic resonance, mass spec, elemental analysis, high performance liquid chromatography, all these methods that all had to converge on the same result, the same identity to say what it is. And that's with the pure substance. So when you have AIDS, though, you have something far more complicated than that, and we accept trivial evidence. Just one little bit of evidence all by itself, a picture of something. We don't know if it's active, we don't know if it's really what they say, you just take their word for it. It's basically dogma, is what's going on in medical schools.
What would you say about the man in Senegal who said they do not have much AIDS there compared with the rest of Africa because they are Muslim, they are faithful?
Well, I don't know if it's because they're Muslim or faithful, but I agree with him. He doesn't have any more AIDS there than anywhere else in Africa. He's right about that.
To what would you attribute the strong prevalence, high degree of correlation of whatever this infirmity is in the gay community?
Drug use. And it's only the drug using, I mean massively drug using gay men. The circuit party. That's why AIDS started in LA, San Francisco, and New York. Those were big metropolitan areas that were gay meccas where these guys were free and they could go to the nightclubs and they would, take amphetamines to keep themselves up all night. They would take the poppers to facilitate anal intercourse. They would do all these sorts of things.
Their drug use is much stronger than non-gay
yes,
types of people.
That's right. Not gays in general. It's only a subset of gays, a small subset. And so that the problem is, when the whole link to sex was only because a bunch of heterosexuals at the CDC said there's something going on with gay guys, and what's the first thing that heterosexuals think of when you hear gay? They don't think of the plays that they've done, they don't think of the great mathematical theorems that they've proven, they think of sex. That is where this whole thing about AIDS being sexually transmitted came from, is because it was happening to gay men. If it was minors, they wouldn't say it was a coal mine.
It must be the mathematical theorems that's at the heart of this correlation.
Yes. Two newsletters I used to receive are so good that I had to hide myself away. And one of them was Art Robinson's newsletter. The other was Reappraising AIDS.
Yes.
Do you have any intentions of publishing that? That's question one.
Right.
Whatever happened to Magic Johnson? That's question.
No, he's still around. He doesn't take the drugs. Contrary to the publicity, the Reappraising AIDS has basically outlived its usefulness. It was originally to get Charlie Thomas, a former Harvard professor, started that drive. He had a 4-sentence letter that he wanted published in Science or Nature or someplace, questioning the HIV hypothesis. That was all. And nobody would publish it, so he got lots of his colleagues to sign this letter. Eventually, there's a couple of thousand people that signed it. And finally, Science published a modified version of it. Now we've got Thabo and Becky, we've got the World AIDS dissidents around the world. So we've just moved on. And then the Magic Johnson thing is interesting because he's sort of the poster boy for heterosexual AIDS in the United States. There's so few of them, you have to have at least one. And he started taking the AZT back in around 1990 or so. Made him so sick he got off of it. Then he went, and then I think it was in the Olympics, and did a great thing. And now, he wrote a book, ghostwritten, about this stuff. So he has a stake in the mainstream thing. About a year ago, he was doing an interview on television, not about AIDS, but one of the interviewers asked him, oh, by the way, are you taking the drugs? And he said no. But now he's in magazines again, and recently somebody asked him, he said, so you take, how often do you take drugs? And magic, I didn't catch this, but somebody else pointed it out to me. He says one takes them 6 times a day, 5 or 6 times a day. And how many Americans answer the question in the third person? You know, I would say how many times? Oh, I take them 4 times a day. But Magic Johnson says one takes them 5 times a day. So I mean, as long as he's healthy, it's a sign he's not taking the drugs. As soon as he starts getting sick, it's a clear sign. Aha, we know he's on the drugs.
Thank you very much.